and we're so glad that you could be here with us today for this very exciting colloquium series that we have and topic that Dr. Craig is going to address. So the topic today is addressing power in bullying is about gender and income inequality. So very timely, very important subject matter. For those who don't know me, my name is Amanda Nickerson. I'm the director of the Alberti Center for Bullying Abuse Prevention here at University at Buffalo. And it's really my honor to introduce Wendy Craig. Before I do that, just a couple housekeeping items. The talk will go for about an hour, and then we'll leave about 15 minutes for questions. So we'll be done promptly at 12:45 Eastern time. And we have received a number of questions that people submitted when they registered. So Dr. Craig has integrated some of those into her talk. I'll also be posing some of them at the end if we haven't gotten to them in some way. But we also welcome you to type questions in the chat, even as we're going along, and I'll kind of save those until the end unless it's a clarifying question. And people can also unmute at the end and ask questions if you would prefer. We will also, there's a question in there about CEU, and yes, we'll be putting a link in after the talk, which will link to an evaluation, which will then get you your certificate of completion, and that is for NASP approved credits, so you can also submit that as a certificate of attendance to other providers as well. So without further ado, it's really my honor to introduce Dr. Wendy Craig, who's a professor in the Department of Psychology at Queen's University in Canada. She's a leading international scientist and expert on bullying prevention and the promotion of healthy relationships. She's a co-founder and scientific co-director of PrevNet, which is Promoting Relationships and Eliminating Violence Network. And through this work, she's transformed the science of bullying and healthy relationships into evidence-based practice, intervention, and policy. Her research focuses on understanding biological, psychological, and social correlates of bullying, victimization, and peer defending. Her secondary area of research is on teen dating violence. So she's examining how to enhance educators' capacity to prevent dating violence and promote healthy relationships through a gender-based lens by providing new training, resources, and methods of disseminating the training. She leads a community of practice of 21 intervention projects addressing teen dating violence. She also co-leads the Canadian team for the Health Behavior Survey for School-Age Children, which is a survey conducted in over 50 countries. She's also worked with the World Health Organization and UNICEF. Additionally, if that's not enough, she's the co-director of the Bullying Research Network, and this is a network designed to promote and assist international collaboration among bullying and peer victimization researchers. In Canada, she acts as an advisor to various government ministries, and her past activities have included briefing the Prime Minister and testifying before the Senate of Canada and advising the Public Health Agency. In recognition of her work, she's won numerous awards, such as the Canadian Psychological Association Award for Distinguished Contributions to Community Service, the Queen's Excellence in Research Prize, the Social Sciences and Humanities Partnership Impact Award, and the Order of Ontario. She's Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and was recently awarded the Order of Canada for her work on bullying, victimization, and knowledge mobilization. So clearly she is one of the leading world experts in bullying, and we're really lucky to have her. She's also a valued member of our advisory council for the Alberti Center. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Dr. Craig.
Hey, well, great. Thank you so much, Amanda. And I'm really excited to be here today and share some of my thinking. And I think that's what today is about. I'm going to give you a little bit of challenging us to think differently in how we think about bullying and victimization and come from a more systemic perspective. And I'm going to substantiate that with some data. But first, I just would like to start with the land acknowledgement. So I am a fourth generation white settler and a guest on the land and the territories in Canada, which is traditionally known as been inhabited by the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territories. And one of the things that I've learned from elders is that it's really important for us to introduce who we are, not what we've achieved, but who we are, because that represents how we bring ourselves to the work and how we bring ourselves to the meeting. So I guess the most important role that I have in life is that I'm a mother. I'm a teacher at the university. I'm a lifelong learner and I love to read. Lessons in Chemistry is a book I recommend for all. And I love to travel and explore the world. And I also love to spend time in nature. So that's who I am. And that will be the perspective that I'm going to bring to the work today. And as a person who's really interested and dedicated to helping children develop in optimal ways, I'm really invested, and it's really important to me that I support the development and become a strong ally and use my privilege to support children and youth in Indigenous communities. So what am I going to talk a bit about today? Well, I'm going to start with, probably to put us all on the same page, just talk a bit about what is bullying. Then I'm going to move to thinking about what is social power? How do we think about power? How does power play itself out in bullying interactions? And then I'm going to start to present some data about looking at inequities in bullying. And by understanding the role of power and how it relates to inequities, it might inform what we can do about it. And then, so I'm going to end with thinking about what can we do to address bullying and victimization, thinking about it from this social power and inequity perspective. So probably familiar to all of you, but this is how I've come to think about bullying over the years. And the first thing I think about it is it's an incredibly destructive relationship. Bullying is a relationship problem where one individual has power over another individual, and they use that power to harm that other individual through aggressive acts. And it's not a one-off event, that's a targeted event that I seek out somebody and I repeatedly, or there's the fear that I will repeatedly come back to harm them with that. And I think one of the critical pieces of the definition of bullying is this notion of power. And we've always thought about power and we've characterized it as an interpersonal problem, that one person might have higher status in terms of being more popular or having more social power in the peer group, or another person might be bigger and stronger. And I think that's one way to think about power. But I think what I want to explore with you in this relationship is to think about how power is reflective of our larger social structures, and that thinking about addressing bullying isn't just about addressing that interpersonal differences in power, but it's understanding who has power, who has privilege, and who's oppressed, and what larger societal and community and classroom and school interactions support that power differential. And I'm going to argue that one of the reasons why we haven't been as successful as we would like in our bullying intervention efforts is because we're not addressing in those intervention efforts the root of bullying and that root of these power imbalances. And one of the ways that we can really see or understand those power imbalances is to thinking about the different kinds of social identities that we bring. And some of those identities are more likely to experience bullying than other identities. So when I talk about identity-based bullying, it's a form of bullying. Some people have called it bias-based victimization or stigma-based bullying, but it's really victimization that is experienced because of who somebody is. And that is really highlights for me this type of victimization about the role of social power. And this kind of bullying really sits at the intersection of discrimination and victimization. And this type of victimization includes reasons for why an individual is victimized, but also what is said to or done to them as part of that victimization. And researchers and scholars have argued that youth who use identity-based bullying are using a targeted form of social dominance that reinforces social hierarchies that exist in our larger society. So I think that's a really interesting framework. And so in part of unpacking that framework is understanding what are the different kinds of identities that people have. And we all have multiple kinds of identities, and they may be based on our sex or our sexuality or our abilities, our race or our class, to name a few. But we all have multiple identities, and those identities can be represented in different social hierarchies. And some identities are given more power and more privilege, while other identities are given less power. And to make this identity argument even more complicated is that we all just don't have one identity, but many of us have many identities, so that we might have some form of disability and be a female. So that would represent an intersectionality of our identity. So why am I focused on identity? Because I think social identities are related to power. And I think this is a powerful sort of diagram to demonstrate that. If we think about it as a web, and we think about each of us are in this web somewhere, and at the center of the web is social power. And the closer we are to the center of the web, the more power, the more social power that we have. And as we move out on the fringes of the web, the less power that we have, or the more, as we move towards the margins of the web, individuals are more subject to increasingly oppressive and marginalizing systems. And so they hold less power, and they're at increased risk for experiencing bullying, for example, racial bullying. And so I think that this sort of is really a really excellent sort of way to capture this idea about how power is, because each of us can be seen in the web. And the other piece that I think it does is it situates us. Each of us are situated somewhere in the web. And so that we're all caught in the web, even though we don't want to be, but where we are in the web will reflect the kind of power that we have and our ability to use that power for good or to harm others. So the other sort of framework that I want you to think about is sort of what we call in the field the socio-ecological perspective of power and aggression. And so what a social ecological perspective highlights is the importance that there are many factors that contribute to bullying. Bullying just isn't about that individual relationship, but it's that individuals are situated within families, within friendship groups, within communities, and within societies where there are governments with different philosophies. And each of those levels shape the developmental context in which individuals grow up. And that kind of shaping includes, I should say, our access to power or how we use power. So that children and youth global access to resources and experiences of structural bias and discriminations can lead to the amount of social power that they hold. And in turn, this social power can shape the community context in which children and youth learn, live, and play. It can shape their relationships and their own individual well-being. So this social power that comes from societal factors can trickle down, if you will, and shape experiences of bullying, because some individuals in that bullying interaction are going to be granted power simply because the privileges that they experience in the larger society. And so they might be given that social power that might make them more likely to be bullied, to bully others, or to be victimized. So in this talk, what I want to do is I want to provide you with some evidence to think about how does power at those larger societal level trickle down to influence that relationship, that very destructive relationship in bullying. So I'm going to do that by presenting some data from the Health Behavior Survey of Children school-age children. This is a survey that's currently done in over 52 countries. Most of them are Western European countries. So it's an international study. And one of the advantages of having an international study is, excuse me, it allows for several things. It allows for us to do international comparisons. So we can look at countries that may be doing well in terms of addressing bullying and victimization and try to figure out why that is. But it also allows us to look at sort of universal processes that might be related to bullying and victimization. So in this case, it allowed myself and my colleagues to look at sort of larger countrywide data on income and gender inequality and see how it was related to bullying and victimization. This cross-national survey started in 1984, so it's been going on for a very long time. Canada first participated in 1990. The US used to be a part of it. They no longer are a part of it. We'd love to see them come back, just a hint for anyone out there. This survey is a cross-sectional study. It's conducted every 4 years. And we just start finishing up collecting our most recent cycle because COVID delayed us a bit, so our 9th cycle. And what we do is we get a national representative example of youth who are aged 11 to 15 in our country. And just to give you a sense of the map, you can see Canada participates and Greenland participates and Iceland participates, and then mostly Western European countries and some Eastern European countries as well are participating. To give you an example of what we get when we do this study is that we can, this graph will show us the percentage of 13-year-olds who have been bullied at least twice in the past couple of weeks. And this data is from the 2018, because we're still collecting the most recent round. And you can see on the bottom here are the countries, and going up the axis is the percentage. And right here, and it's not a good day for Canada because it represents the percentage of youth who have reported being bullied. And that's about 16% of youth, and it's who report being victimized by bullying. And it's equal for boys and girls in Canada. And in terms of where we rank with all the other survey countries, we're near the bottom. We're in the bottom 20%. So for all of those who thought that Canada was filled with nice people, unfortunately, we have a high rate of bullying among our children and youth, and we have a lot of work to do. So I wanted you to think about sort of this, I want to make real sort of what I talked about in terms of these different social identities. And so I'm going to show you a series of graphs now that the main point of showing this graphs is to show that different identities have different risk levels for being involved in bullying and gender. So on this graph, as you go up the axis, it's the percent of kids that are involved. This first bar that's appeared is for boys. And you can see on the bottom are the different kinds of bullying. So verbal, social exclusion, not allowing kids into their groups, was physical bullying, spreading rumors about individuals, weight-based content, so being bullied because of your weight, or sexual-based bullying, being bullied with sexual kinds of comments. So there's the prevalence for boys, and you can see as you look at it, it's about 18% of boys who are saying they're being verbally bullied, 11 to 12% socially excluded, and so on as you go down the line. Here's the girls. So the girls are in orange here, and you can see that girls are more likely, for example, to report being socially excluded. They're more likely to have social rumors as the content, the way that they're bullied. They're less likely to be physically bullied, and probably equally, surprisingly likely to be bullied because of their weight or sexual behavior. The third line I'm going to show you is what we call gender diverse youth or non-binary youth. And what should strike you immediately is that these youth are at the highest risk. So these youth who are gender diverse are most likely to experience being victimized by bullying. And this sort of highlights that this gender identity puts them at risk for experiencing being victimization. And it's not just at risk for being victimized because of who they are, because of like by the content, but just because of who they are. That is, because they are gender diverse, they are more likely to experience all forms of bullying. Here's one where we asked students about weight-based bullying. And again, in particular, this is how often they experience it. So I'm unpacking one of those bars on the last one. And what you can see here is that on the last end here, it says several times a week. So those gender diverse youth are, not only are they more likely to experiencing bullying, weight-based bullying, but they're more likely to experience it frequently and regularly. And so this starts to help us understand why they're experiencing the most negative outcomes associated with being victimized. Here's a graph on sexual based bullying. And again, it's designed the same way. And we have exactly the same finding, is that those youth who are gender diverse are most likely to experience sexual based bullying more frequently than any other group. And I think, again, that highlights that notion that I've been talking about, that because of their sexual identity, they're at higher risk for experiencing bullying. Here's another identity, again, using the HBSC. So these two bars represent non-racialized and racialized groups. And what you can see is racialized groups are more likely than non-racialized groups to experience verbal bullying, social exclusion, physical bullying, social rumors, weight, but less likely to experience sexual bullying. So in general, for most types of bullying, because of their social identity, they're more likely to experience bullying. And it's not just with content due to their race, but it's in general, all forms of bullying. So I think that sort of helps demonstrate this point, that because of your identity. Here's an identity that's related to poverty. So we asked questions about poverty, and what you can see again here is that, so those youth who are food insecure are more likely to, again, to experience verbal bullying, social exclusion, physical bullying, social rumors, weight-based bullying, but not sexual bullying. So again, youth who have one of their social identities as living in poverty are more likely to experience all forms of bullying. And then here's one that just sort of is an interesting one that is related to body mass index. So with body mass index, like as your weight increases, you're more likely, this graph, to experience bullying more frequently. So all of these graphs have been, that I've gone through rather quickly, but they make the same point, is by virtue of having a social identity, that different identities are more at risk for experiencing not only victimization because of that identity, but also victimization in general. And why is that? I'm going to argue because it has to do with how power is passed through from our society kind of level. I think the other piece that I just want to sort of say, why are we so concerned about this? And again, I'm probably preaching to the choir, but we know that children who bully are learning over time to use power and aggression together, and they learn how to use it in their peer relationships, and then they transfer it to other relationships, like their romantic relationships, their marital relationships, onto their children, and then onto elder abuse. That various aspects of these pathway of the development of power and aggression have been established by other researchers. So, for example, bullying at age 14 predicts violent convictions by age 20, low job status by age 25, drug use at age 32, and unsuccessful life outcomes at 48. So by thinking about bullying early on and intervening in bullying early on, we can start to address that development of power and aggression, and that. And then the other piece that's really been added in here that's really important to know is that bullying is related to homophobic name calling and sexual harassment. And that actually predicts in high school teen dating violence. And so, and what's surprising to many people is that that connection is true for both boys or girls. So I think that connection is really important, that it's been established early and it's related to long-term outcomes, and really helps speak to the importance of breaking that cycle, or understanding the role that power has in it. Okay, so now I'm going to step back. I started off with talking about the social ecological perspective and how it's important to look at those more societal factors that might be related to power, and how do they relate to the interpersonal dynamics of bullying and victimization. So the HBSC allows us to look at that. And so one of the questions that we tried to get at that was to look at, how is country level wealth associated with bullying and victimization? So we know that there's various different research has found that various forms of interpersonal violence, like firearm assault, sexual assaults, racism, homicide, child maltreatment, are more prevalent in areas where income inequality is greater. There has also sort of been systemic reviews on income inequality and violent crime. And what they've concluded is that there's a significant association between income inequality and these rates of homicide, assault, rape, and robbery. So we wanted to know, is that true at a country level, and how does it relate to bullying and victimization? So we took the HBSC, and you start to gain a lot of power. And we were really interested in looking at the frequency of bullying and victimization among only the 11-year-olds. So in 37 countries, we had a large sample, like almost 34,000 girls and 33,000 boys from 37 countries that participated. And from the HBSC, we're able to look at individual family wealth. And we can also look at from different indicators of the country level wealth. And one of the indicators that we were interested in it was looking at the gross domestic product. So you can get that from the United Nations Program Human Development Report. And we are also interested in looking at a measure of income inequality. And the common measure that's used to look at inequality, it's something called the Gini index. And the most important thing you need to know about the Gini index is that it represents the distribution of income among everybody in a society, and it ranges from 0 to 1. And when it's 0, it means that all people in that country have equal income. And when it's 1, it means that only one person has all of the income and the rest have none. So that's how the Gini index works. So in a series of analyses, I'm going to show you a graph, and I'm going to try and unpack this graph. So on the bottom is the Gini index. So remember, the higher the Gini index, so as I move along this axis, the greater the inequality. Okay, and on here we have the percentage of being bullied 2 or more times. And then all of these dots represent different countries. So what did we find? Well, the first thing that we found was that the country level inequality was associated with an increased likelihood of being victimized for boys and for girls. And that relationship, country level inequality, was associated with being bullied for boys and girls, even after controlling for individual wealth and country wealth. So in other words, that inequality matters in terms of identifying who's at risk to be more likely to be bullied and victimized. The other thing is that relationship really shows, if we go up here to the higher countries, so the like Turkey had high inequality, right? And down here it's Sweden and Iceland and Denmark, that there was less income inequality. Well, what the results really showed is the percentage of respondents who bullied was 4 to 5 times higher in countries with high income inequality, like Turkey and like Russia, compared to countries with low income inequality, like Denmark and Sweden. So I think it's really important. The take-home message here is country level inequality, income inequality, is associated with being bullied. The greater the inequality, the increased likelihood of being victimized. In addition, country wealth and individual individual wealth were negatively associated, right? So it actually went in the opposite direction for those outside of the equation. Okay, so what does this mean, or what does it mean in terms of what I've talked about? Well, I mean, one of the implications is, well, if we had countries where there was more egalitarian societies, then we'd reduce bullying. What's the chances of us doing that? Fairly unlikely. But it does highlight our needs to address this in the socio-ecological model. So if we go back to the socio-ecological model, how does inequality at a country or a societal level trickle down and have that relationship about it? What does that mean in terms of what we have to do? Well, what it means at a pragmatic level is that we need to recognize the attitudes and the behaviors that underlie that inequality discrimination at the individual level. So what's happening in our schools on the ground where youth are recognizing that inequality and then treating others differently because of that inequality. The other thing that it means is that we need to focus our intervention areas, efforts, in areas where income inequality is high. So it's not just that youth that who are at risk come from deprived socioeconomic backgrounds, but it's youth who are in schools where that income inequality is high, that is more likely to put them at risk. So understanding what are the attitudes in those kinds of schools that are that are related to perpetration, that are related to those attitudes and behaviors that might privilege some people in that school and give them power versus not privilege others. So this is one example about how income inequality at a country level is impacting interpersonal interactions on the ground at a school level. I want to give you another example about thinking about, well, if it's inequality and it matters and it's associated with bullying and victimization, are there windows of sensitivity where we should be addressing income inequality that can reduce that likelihood of it playing out when our youth are 11 years old, right? So in other words, are there periods where inequality really matters, like 0 to 5, or in middle childhood, or in adolescence? So again, we tried to answer this question, and we used the health behavior survey of children and youth. And basically what we were able to do is we were able to look at it in different cohorts. So we were able to look at the frequency of bullying in all our different cohorts in these different countries in 1994, 1998, 2002, 2006, 2010, and 2014. And so we had this huge sample where we had almost 450,000 females and 426,000 males from 162 countries surveys groups, and who were in 29,000 different schools. And what we were able to do is we were able to say, okay, in 1994, when they were 11, what was the situation in terms of their country wealth and their Gini index from 0 to 5, and then from 6 to 10, and then at their current level. So in other words, we could look back in time at those country level index, and we could link individual country data using the children's birth years, the survey years, and the nationalities. And then we tested our hypothesis about the lagged association between income inequality and bullying. So again, how did we do it? We had our socioeconomic position. So we had the individual and the country and the year. We had our gross national income for the years from when they were born. And then we had our Gini index from when they were born up to when we collected the data when they were 11 years old. And what did we find? Well, this is kind of interesting. So there are 3 graphs here. The first graph, this one, looks at children who are bullied only. This looks at the children who perpetrated the bullying. And this graph looks at the children who engaged in both bullying others and being bullied. And on the bottom here is you have the age exposed to inequality. So from 0 to 4, 6, 8, and 10 years old. Okay, and up here, this sort of tells you about sort of the likelihood of bullying others. Sorry. And so what does this graph show us? Well, this bump says to us that income inequality experienced between 0 and 5 was related to being victimized at age 11, versus here, this line is much more flat and a little bump, but it's not related. So this is not related to being bullied when you're age 11. So experiencing income inequality from age 6 to 10 was not related to being bullied at age 11, but experiencing it early in the first 5 years of life was. In contrast, bullying others, which this finding surprised us the most, it was not, income inequality experienced at any point in time was not related to bullying others or perpetrating bullying at age 11. And this one, again, it's a lot like our first graph here. So being income inequality experienced early, so from 0 to 5, was related to both perpetrating and being victimized. So early inequality mattered for if you were going to be victimized. It was related to being victimized, or it related to having dual involvement, that being victimized or being bullied. So it's 0 to 5 that matters. So what is the meaning of this? Well, the first message from this is early life inequalities influences the developmental trajectories of bullying. Between 0 and 5, being bullied in adolescence was associated with early life exposure to income inequalities. Now, there are lots of things that income inequality might be a proxy for. So, for example, those families that experienced early life inequality, it might be a proxy for psychological stress or an adversity that's going to alter that developmental trajectory or processes. So it could be related to a lot of different things but the most important message is that early life inequality did predict the trajectories of bullying. But we do need to understand and unpack what was that early life inequality a proxy for. The other thing is that, what does it mean? Well, it means that we need to really invest in prevention before school starts. In that period of 0 to 5, we need to reduce inequality in that period of time, and that in turn will reduce bullying experiences of children much later. We need to focus on children in areas where there's high income inequality for our bullying prevention. And it's not about individual levels of wealth or individual levels of poverty. It's inequality is what we really need to champion and focus on, and we need to do it early in life. Okay, I want to just talk about another social identity, which is gender and gender inequality. I've talked a lot about how that power imbalance is a central characteristic of bullying. Well, feminist theory suggests that the root cause of interpersonal violence is the power and control imbalance that exists between men and women on a societal level. So one way to understand the way that gender plays in bullying is to examine or think about gender norms. And gender norms are sort of the spoken and unspoken rules of acceptable behaviors of girls and boys that sustain the hierarchies of power. And gender differences in bullying, what we wanted to investigate, and this one could be anchored in sort of these gender differences or gender sort of gender ideals around that. So adolescent bullying could be seen as a way that of perpetrating masculine dominance or gender inequality, or as a way of endorsing sort of gendered cultural norms of behavior. And so what we were really thinking about when we were working on this paper was, if men and women have unequal access to power through social structures or societal structures like politics or economics or social or health and education, then we're creating probably a culture where there's unhealthy gender norms, and they're reinforcing the notion of male superiority and female inferiority. So if male dominate those institutions, then the policies and the practices of those institutions will reinforce those kinds of norms. And so we thought it was really important to look at this from that societal level, to look at who had power, what were the kinds of norms that were perpetuated in those larger social structures, and how was it related to bullying and victimization. So again, we used the HBSC as a way of doing this. And we looked at, in this one we did with the 2018 data, and we were really interested in the 4 types of bullying. So we looked at the frequency of bullying and victimization on and offline. And again, we had our individual measure of socioeconomic status. We had our school and level and gender composition of the school. And then we had country level and index of gender inequality. And we used the United Nations Development Program. And this index sort of combines a health dimension. So it looks at what are the maternal mortality ratio, the adolescent fertility rate. It has an empowerment dimension, which looks at the proportion of parliamentary seats that are occupied by females and education attainment by gender. And it has a labor dimension, which looks at women's participation in the workforce. And like the Gini, the GII takes values from 0 to 1, and with higher values indicating higher levels of inequity. So what we're looking at is, do these sort of we used it as a combined index, right, from 0 to 1. So does this composite index, so with how does gender inequality relate to bullying and victimization? And what did we find? Well, okay, we have found, I have 4 different graphs to show you here. On the top is bullying, victimization, and bullying others. So that's the more traditional face-to-face. And on the bottom is cyber victimization and cyberbullying others. And along here, like the other graphs, we have our gender inequality index. And up here, we have sort of scores related to bullying, victimization, or bullying others. And what did we find? These graphs sort of show us 4 different things that I think are important. First of all, we found that gender inequality was more closely related to traditional victimization. So as you can see in this graph, like as gender inequality went up, the frequency of victimization went up. It was more related to cyber victimization. Again, it went up. And it was more related to bullying others. Again, it went up. So those have steeper slopes. There was an interaction of gender and national gender inequality. And that was not associated, so it was not found for perpetration. We found that traditional bullying, perpetration, and victimization, the direction of the interactions that we did found indicated that a larger gender difference where national gender inequality was higher. Okay, so, but for cyber victimization, the larger difference was observed in countries with low gender inequality. So that was a bit of a surprise. And with increasing societal gender inequality, the gender gap closes and swaps direction. And you can see that here, the gender gap closes and swaps direction. So the probabilities for involvement in bullying increase with higher gender inequality in both boys and girls. However, for both forms of victimization, that increase was steeper for boys. So what does that mean, or how do we interpret this? Well, it means that structural gender inequality and gender norms relate to gender differences in bullying. Where there is more gender inequality in countries, there are greater gender differences in some forms of bullying and victimization. So in order to address this, we need to work more directly with adolescents in schools and think about gender inequality as a societal, like how that's trickling down to those interactions. So bullying prevention efforts, we have to work and address those sociocultural gender norms that might be trickling down. And we need to target the social and cultural factors that shape those gender norms in society and among young people. So all of this is to say that we can't, like these examples that I've talked about, it's not about addressing those individual dynamics that happen between children and youth on the playground. It's simply not enough. That there are these larger structural factors that relate to social identities, relate to who has power and who has privilege, and how that power and privilege gets transmitted downward to influence that bullying and victimization relationship. So it's just simply not enough. Like what I've shown you today is that marginalized youth have a higher risk for being both not because of individual factors, but because of the larger social systems that are shaping interactions at the individual level. So we have to move our thinking, like often we think about, like when we think about that oppression occasionally happens, that we see these occasional incidences in our schools of oppression. But no, oppression is ordinary in schools and it impacts everything. It's ordinary, and we see it in bullying interactions, and we see it in every other kind of interaction. So we need to proactively and reactively address it. I think the other thing that we need to think about moving forward, or one of the big implications from what I'm talking about, is effective violence prevention is not just about focusing on that individual, but it's really about focusing on systems of oppression. And we need to proactively and reactively address those systems of oppression. So what does it mean for you? What does it mean for you who are working in schools? I think it has a couple of different things. And I'm going to return to my socio-ecological model and think about what do we need to do at each of those levels. And I think one of the cases that I've made is we need to address inequality and structural barriers at a societal level, that we need to recognize that oppression isn't about the individual and interpersonal actions. It's a result of structural advantage and disadvantage. And so until we address that at the societal level, we're not going to be as successful as we hope we are when we deal with individual bullying. And so, like, when I think about that is that we need to shift from thinking about that, we can address that. And I think one way that lots of people have addressed it is, okay, we have anti-bias training in our schools or things, but anti-bias training isn't going to address that accumulative impact of the institutional, cultural, and structural injustices that need to be addressed. We need to address those in an ideological and institutional and cultural and structural way at its very core. So the root causes of bullying and social power are not just thinking about in our schools or our society about our racist policies, but they're thinking about how did we arrive at some of those policies that are at a larger level that are influencing what's going on at the individual level. So when we think about it, what does it mean in terms of our community? Well, we need to look at our community and think about what are the norms and practices? What are the kinds of things that are enabling some of those structural biases? And so when we think about how we're going to address it, we need to involve community partners. We need to involve community-based practices and policies. We need to involve community trainers, because we need to work with those kinds of power imbalances that go beyond our school, but are also reflective within our communities. And we need to think about how do we address or deal with, or what are the kinds of gender inequities in our communities? What are the kinds of income inequities in our communities? And we need to think about what can we do with those at that level. I think we have a lot of work to create equitable schools. And I think an equitable school is not one where we focus on individual people's needs, but one where we actively identify and eliminate all forms of biases and inequity. And we need to actively develop anti-biases and equitable policies and practices and cultures. And so we need to ask tough questions in our schools, like who's benefiting from the ways our schools operate? Who's marginalized? We need to recognize what are the subtle biases within our schools and within our classrooms, within our learning materials and our classroom interactions. I think it's like one thing that we can do is we can show a lot of curiosity about the way that school policy and practices might be advantaging or disadvantaging some students in an unintentional or intentional way. We need to sort of think about and really represent in our schools that the inequities are a result of cultural or mindsets of our students, but really they're about these larger social issues. we need to sort of think about naming the problem. And it's not like naming like the problem in the bullying interaction that might be right in front of us, but we might think about what's maybe more hidden, like what's our existing biases, what are the inequities, what are the interpersonal tensions, are there stereotypes or prejudice or assumptions? But we need to step back and be curious about it. We need to think about sort of what are the obvious and less obvious ways that we're privileging and not privileging people. We need to focus on sort of, like what's the content of our resources? What's the content of our curriculum? We need to focus on our school practices and policies. How are we privileging some? How are we inadvertently harming others? And then we need to think about how do we build that positive classroom and those positive classroom climates. And it's about inclusion, but it's also about recognizing the biases, recognizing the privileges, and recognizing the prejudices that might exist in our classroom. And when it unfolds, we need to name it and talk about it and intervene. And we need to change the way that we do things so that it doesn't continue to get supported within our classroom. So we need to think about, what are fair and equitable solutions when something happens. We need to think about how can we respond right now to a bullying situation that might reflect those inequities, but we also might think about what do we need to do in the long term to mitigate that inequity that might be underlying that power imbalance, like what are the larger scale solutions? And then what are actions that we need to take in order to enact those solutions now and into the future? I think at the peer level, we need to be aware of sort of what is the social norming going on among our peer groups? What is the basis for inclusion and in support? So who's getting recognized in our peer? Who has status in our peer, in our classrooms? How do they obtain that power, that status? How can we share that status more equitably across the classroom? And create the peer groups that are norming the kinds of values about equity and inclusion that we want. We need to promote youth to intervene when they see inequities in the classroom. And we can do that through bystander intervention. So it's not just about bullying, but it's training and thinking and having youth and empowering youth to intervene in situations where there might be power imbalances relationship because who's privileged and who has power in the classroom. And then we also need to give those youth the skills. Yes, we need to develop the conflict resolution skills and the empathy and perspective taking skills and the other social emotional learning kinds of skills. But we need to do that through a lens of an appreciation for diversity, through a lens of helping youth recognize what are their unconscious biases, having them recognize what their power is and how they're using their power as central to that kind of behavior. So I think we have much, much more work to be done to understand how power plays out from the larger social systems at the individual level of bullying and victimization and in those individual dynamics. I think one of the things that I hope you're going to take away is that these are systemic problems. They're not problems that are solved by addressing the individual interaction, that we have to look at how it's translated from society to our communities, to our schools, and to our classrooms, and to our peer relationships in the classrooms, and then down to the individuals. That it's going to require large shifts. And if we're ever going to really address and eradicate bullying, we need to think about the role that social power has and how it comes through each of those different levels. And it's really critical. So we're just learning how. We're learning more how to talk about it. We're learning about the importance of a social justice perspective. We're learning in our classrooms to prevent bullying. We're learning about taking, equity sort of learning and skills into our classroom and how those can address bullying and victimization. So I would just really encourage you, if you think about the messages that I want you to take away today, it's really about recognizing that bullying is not happening just at the interpersonal level, that it really represents the power and the privilege and the social power dynamics that are happening from a structural societal level and how they trickle down. At PrevNet, we've started to think about this, and we've had been working on developing some resources for educators, and these are all free, and you can go there and you can get it. Here's the link, but if you go to www.prevnet, you can get these resources, and they really are resources to help support educators think about how to prevent identity-based bullying. There's 5 that we've developed. We have a whiteboard video on power, privilege, oppression, and intersectionality. We have a PowerPoint presentation. We have a script that goes with it that you can, and a slide deck that you can change and adapt. And we have a discussion guide for your classroom. We have another 15-minute PowerPoint video on development of power, and the same thing with the script and the slide deck and discussion guide. We have one that thinks about how do peers play and how to engage, another one that thinks about how do we engage peers as allies. And then we have one that I think is really important that everybody should do, that really helps people think about what are their own biases and how do our own biases, are they reflected in our interaction with others, and how we use our power and how we use our privilege. So I just want to say that this work can be done with lots of other people. So a huge thank you to all of my colleagues and the funding agencies that participated and enabled this work to do. And thank you to you for listening. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer those. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for such an enlightening and important presentation. So as I said in the beginning, I encourage people to put questions in the chat and or unmute if you have questions. But I think I'll start with one that came in before the talk, and you definitely touched on this and broadening this from just children in schools and looking at it as in an individual level and looking at it from a structural perspective. But someone had asked, so if this child behavior continues to adulthood, how might this present in the workplace? So I think they're kind of asking what might this look like, and is this different than what we might see in a school setting?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. So I think there's lots of evidence to show that it's going to look a lot similar. So there's going to be sexual harassment. So bullying happens in the workplace. It's related in the workplace to sexual harassment. It's related to discrimination against different social identities. And so all of the things that we see or that I talked about being played out in that bullying and victimization dynamic are played out in the workplace, and it's related to those exact things: increased likelihood of being bullied and harassed for different social identities, and that those different identities are going to be less likely to get promoted. They're less likely to get awarded merit increases in salary. They're less likely to get equal salary. So all of those things play out and they're more likely to experience a hostile work environment. So they all play out in the workplace. So what we see in childhood relates to what we see in adulthood.
Another question was, how prepared are educators in school settings to address bullying of a victim based on ethnicity and or culture?
I think that this is one of the places, and thank you for raising this question because it's such an important issue. And I think that we need to do way more to support educators. We've just done a review of different programs across the country in Canada, and educators get like a day's worth of training on how to, taking this equity lens. And I think we need to spend way more time training educators and providing them with the resources that they need to create equity literacy, like training in equity literacy, training in how to intervene in identity-based bullying and other forms of bullying, And that they don't get that, and we need to do it. And it's not something that you can learn one off. That part of this is the enhancing your own self-awareness about what your own biases are, how your own life experiences have taken you, and what's your power and privilege. And then thinking about, once I understand that, then how do I work with the children in my classroom to help them understand that kind of information? And that's a huge task. And I think we need to do much more work in developing the resources and supporting educators, that we just don't do enough of it.
Mhm. Somewhat related, and you definitely addressed this when you were talking about the social norms intervention, bystander intervention training. We had someone ask, how can teachers support students with privilege to authentically leverage their purpose to mitigate harm and biases?
Yeah, I think that's a huge question, and I wish I had a really great answer for that. And I think, when you look at the work, like it relates, like the work on equity literacy. I mean, equity literacy, tell or suggest to people that you need to teach those youth to recognize the behavior, to recognize that they have the privilege, and so they have the responsibility to respond. So they need to do something immediate in the moment. I think the other piece that they need to do is recognize, respond, and the other bigger one is redress it. It's thinking about like recognizing I have this power and privilege, and it's not about but shift the focus to redressing like what underlies that kind of behavior, or what underlies my privilege and power. So I've heard someone talk about it as fire prevention. So we have to teach those peer allies to recognize and respond in the moment, like that is put out in the fire. But we also have to teach those peers to think about redressing it, which is getting at sort of the root causes, like fire prevention in this metaphor. So to think about, more deeply about how can I use my power and privilege in everyday moments, not just in the moment of reacting and intervening, but in that everyday moment to share, how can I share my power and how can I share my privilege? And so it's not just about using my privilege when bullying happens, but it's about using my privilege to ensure and to prevent bullying from happening in the first place, and to cultivate sort of that the notion of justice and equity. And then I think it's really important to think about helping individuals, how they helping peers sustain that efforts, like sustain their ability to do activities that would reflect inclusion and equity over the long term. So quick answer, that was very convoluted, but the quick answer is you want to teach them to recognize when bullying happens and teach them to respond. So that's that bystander piece. But then you want to teach them to what I call comes from the equity literacy work, which is to redress it, to think about in the long term, how can I engage in acts by including others, by that are happening outside of that actual bullying interaction, but are just happening in their normal day-to-day interactions on the playground or in the classroom or in the halls, and give them that equity lens where they're engaging in activities that really reflect justice and equity and inclusion.
Excellent. So we had a question, and this is, I think, when you were presenting the data on non-binary individuals and bullying, and the comment was, gender as an identity, is really heavily on my mind. There's such discrimination towards transgender youth, especially in sports. And just kind of reflecting on how that's a polarizing and controversial issue. I get they didn't really have a question, but I wondered if you wanted to comment on that and how that relates to the data that you presented or the work that you do, or if that has been something that's been a bit separate.
Yeah, I think it's a bit separate, but there are two things that I want to highlight from that are relevant. The first is I do want to say, in the health behavior survey of school age children, we're really limited by our question that we can't ask about those subgroups, and like not all of those groups are going to experience bullying in the same way. So it's really important that we we separate and start to understand the different experiences of those different identities. That's the first thing. But the second piece that related to sport is, I think that's a really great example about how the sort of larger political structures about that are harmful and discriminatory translate down into these bullying interactions that we see in the school, right? It's not only that are the youth experiencing when they're in school, but we see it in professional sport, and that so it's getting role modeled, it's getting reflected in our interactions in school, that kind of attitude and that kind of discrimination. And I think that's a really good example about how what happens in school relationships reflects what's happening in our larger culture, and how we have to really move the needle in our larger society.
Great. So at the beginning of your presentation, you spoke about the different identities and showed graphically those more on the outside of identities are more prone to bullying and victimization, but you really centered the data analysis piece on income inequity and gender inequity. Wonder about race and ethnicity in particular, and not to push beyond the data that you were presenting, but how does that fit in? Have you done empirical work in that area? It just seems like another really important context of inequity that I'm wondering about.
Absolutely, it is a super important. We haven't been able to do that. It's a bit more challenging, like, because I was using the health behavior survey of children and youth, and so we're in 50 different countries, so that racism looks different in different countries. So I couldn't sort of demonstrate the same point in the same way with this data, but there is lots of other empirical research that I haven't done that indicates that Black children are much more likely, for example, in the States, to experience the different forms of victimization. And so that like those other identities are at increased risk to be victimized by bullying. And so I think there's lots of other research that supports, those different identities also being marginalized and also being at increased risk for experiencing this type of bullying.
Thank you.
And they're all. I didn't mean to prioritize at all. Like, I just wanted to talk about a few in particular that we had data on, but all of these identities are extremely important, and we need to ensure that we use our power in ways that can prevent that kind of discrimination and biases.
Thank you. We have another question here that says, "Hi, Dr. Craig, thank you for your talk. Do you have any recommended measures on early adolescents' understanding of social power, specifically maybe their own power versus that of others?"
No, you know what? I think this is a real absence in the literature. Lots of people like Tony Vogt have looked at it in terms of being goal-oriented and what are their kinds of goals from having that power. But I don't think we've looked at it in terms of how we use that social power in our social interactions as much. So I wish I did, and whoever you are, please talk to me, because I'd love to know what ideas that you have, because I think it's a really important next step. And I think it will help us unpack some of these relationships. So really important area.
Great. And there was also a question, and I know you've mentioned equity literacy, and someone's asking, are there any existing programs or interventions that promote teachers' equity literacy and or multicultural competencies?
Oh, that's such a great question. You know what, I could send you what I think there were two special issues on the International Journal of School Mental Health that focused on this. And I can send you that reference, because I think that would probably give a summary of the most up-to-date information that there is.
Excellent. And we can send that out after the talk. That would be perfect.
If I was competent, I'd be doing both at the same time, but I'm not that competent.
Oh, no. Isn't there a literature that multitasking really isn't, it doesn't mean competency, so. Great. All right, I don't see any more questions, and I feel like you did a great job of handling questions from all different areas and aspects. So again, we'd really like to thank you for sharing this important work, and thank you all that are attending. I see a lot of notes and thank yous in the chat. So we're very appreciative, and I hope that everybody has a wonderful day and week, and continues to do good work, a lot of work, not just in our kids in schools, as we know, but really seeing this as an issue of equity and working towards trying to live in a more equitable world.
Okay, well, thank you for the opportunity, and thank you everyone for all the work that you do every day to ensure that we all use our power in a positive and proactive way to support others.